Welcome, everyone. We have a great and very important topic to discuss today with a fantastic panel, which I will introduce alphabetically, starting from my far right. Baroness Catherine Ashton, member of the House of Lords and former EU High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy. Welcome, Baronessa.
Thank you.
Ambassador David Cvach, France's permanent representative to NATO. John Feiner, who served as Principal Deputy National Security Advisor in the Biden administration, currently with Colombia. And last but not least, Ambassador Georgette Mosbacher, well known here in Poland, where she served as the US ambassador during President Trump's first term. And my name is Majda Ruge. I am Senior Policy Fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. I work with our US team, and we've spent the last 3 years building networks and analyzing foreign policy camps in the Republican Party. So, the title of this panel suggests that the transatlantic relationship can emerge stronger as a result of Donald Trump's second-term policies. And the underlying assumption here is that President Trump's transactional approach creates a sort of a win-win situation whereby Europeans are stepping up, spending more on defense, following the Hague Summit, committing to spend 5% of their GDP on defense, and basically, by default, strengthening the alliance. That is one narrative. And you hear it often in Washington and NATO headquarters in Brussels. America is just shifting burden to Europeans, but remains committed to Ukraine and European security. The other narrative is that America is no longer in the sort of same mental space as Europeans, and Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, diplomatic reaction to President Trump's tweet on Ukraine, being able to take back its territory with support of Europe, said that we need to read between the lines and that it means America is out and Europe is alone in this war. Better truth than illusions. So what we want to discuss on this panel today is really what are the implications of Donald Trump's domestic and foreign policy revolution for Europe. Clearly, there's more to the alliance than just security in Ukraine, so we will try to do a couple of rounds, not just on Ukraine and NATO, but also on Indo-Pacific, China, and if we get to Middle East. So please keep your answers short. We will run this as more as a conversation rather than formal statement. So we'll start with Ambassador Mosbacher. We had at ECFR 2025 survey on sort of how the EU publics in different member states describe the US. And majorities in every EU member state describe the US as a necessary partner rather than an ally. Even in Poland, only 31% use the word ally. Are they right to be worried? Or can you, if you were the ambassador in Warsaw right now, what sort of words of reassurance could you offer in terms of direction of travel and commitment to European security?
I assume this is on. Thank you for the question. If I were ambassador in Warsaw right now, I'd say the same thing I said when I was ambassador in Warsaw in Trump's first term. He actually hasn't changed his policy. If you recall his first term, he said, go to 2%. And I can remember very well being called names, and Trump was a bully, and the Americans were bullies. And then Russia went into Ukraine, and you all realized, Europe realized, they didn't invest in their own security. And to put this in context, particularly from what you said, look, there's 320 million Americans, there are 500 million Europeans. We understood after World War II that you needed to rebuild Europe, and you needed security guarantees. The 320 million American taxpayers invested in the strongest military in the world. And we guaranteed your safety and your security while you were rebuilding Europe. Well, Trump came in and said, wait a minute, you're rich now. And you can't ask 320 million Americans, taxpayers, to invest in your security if you're not willing to do it yourself. And that was his argument about the 2%. Now, it hasn't changed. We were there in World War I, we were there in World War II. I can tell you as ambassador, brought 10,000 American troops to Poland. We put up the 5th Corps headquarters. We did the Defense Cooperation Agreement. We did LNG. Poland was energy independent way before this was the argument. The fact is that I think the problem is that when you hold a mirror up or you criticize someone, you don't like it. I get that. But you're going to have to take some responsibility for your feckless energy policy for 10 years, and which led to this war. But that doesn't mean that the U.S. isn't with you. We are with you. It's just that we're saying, guess what? You have to prove to us that you're going to be a good ally for us. And that means you have to invest in your security.
Thank you. John, do you want to comment on this? Or do you agree? Do you disagree? Are the strategic goals of U.S. and EU still aligned? What's your view?
So I think there are elements of that I'd agree with, elements of that I would disagree with. But I think taking a half step back, it's undeniable that one thing that has changed fairly dramatically in this strategic landscape is we have an administration in the U.S., and I say this, by the way, not as a political comment. I spent 4 years rolling my eyes at former government officials telling our administration how to do their job, so I'd say this with a lot of humility, that just has a different worldview from basically all of its predecessors in a couple of key areas. But the main one being that the international system, agreements, institutions, alliances, has been stacked against the United States, not for the United States, that we extract less from it than we put into it. I think that is a kind of a core belief, again, from the outside of this administration. And there are a lot of things that flow from that relate to this alliance in particular. One is our administration thought it was a strategic advantage for the United States to globalize our alliances. We asked our European partners to invest themselves in our strategy in the Indo-Pacific, in our competition with China, and they stepped up to some extent to do that. We asked our Indo-Pacific partners, Koreans, Japanese, Australians, to get on board with supporting Ukraine in this war of aggression waged by Russia, and they did do that when many people predicted that they wouldn't. This administration, my sense from talking to people who spend much more time engaging them than I do, is that this administration's view is much more stay in your lane. Europeans should focus on Europe. Indo-Pacific countries should focus on the Indo-Pacific. The United States will do what it has to do in both theaters. So that's one big change. The other is this administration seems inclined to focus much more on our own country and our own hemisphere in terms of military resources, which is a big, big change. What are our adversaries doing in response to that strategic landscape? The Russians, clearly, in recent weeks, are starting to now test for the first time in a serious way since the war began the resolve of NATO. Incursions here, incursions in other states, sabotage operations across Europe. We've been wrestling this for quite some time. I do not believe Russia wants war with NATO. I think they have actually been deterred from seeking war with NATO, but I think they want to go as far as they can to impose costs on NATO countries short of the threshold of war, which is a test for the alliance. And I think China is taking a different approach. They are seeking to engage this administration, the U.S. administration, in a negotiation to see if they can get a big deal while putting pressure on America's Indo-Pacific partners. So there's a lot that has changed, and I think much of it flows from just a different way of looking at the world and how it's organized.
Thank you. Separating theaters and Europeans sort of being responsible for their own theater sort of implies that the U.S. is no longer really involved, even if we don't have huge troop withdrawals that some were expecting at the beginning of Trump administration. So we have the National Defense Strategy coming up, and the rumor is that it's going to prioritize Western Hemisphere, as you said, John. But separation of theaters has huge implication for Europeans. I guess that's sort of music to French ears. But David, I will leave you to comment after Katrin. Katrin, so what does this look like from where you're sitting, both with your sort of UK and EU hat in terms of security implications that it has for Europe, and specifically, how do we need to think in the context of changing America, how do we need to think about our own strategy regarding Ukraine, Russia, and European security?
So I'm still European, so. I think it's really important to recall that in 1963, John F. Kennedy made some very strong statements about the fact that the Europeans were not stepping up and contributing in a way that they should, and that Americans were bearing the brunt of European security and defense. This is nothing new. Every president since then has made the point, some more loudly, some more directly, and certainly in the case of President Trump, with greater effect than other presidents have done in the past. Unquestionably, the Ukraine crisis and the war of Russia's invasion has woken European leaders up to the issue. But I would say, having been responsible for looking at European defence, that we still don't do enough on some very simple ways that we could improve our defence and security capabilities. And that's to do with economies of scale. We still have 11 or 12 different versions of the same planes or tanks. We paint them different colours, very nice blues and greens and browns, but they're still whatever they are at the end of it. We don't do the collaborative work that is not about giving up sovereignty as nations, but is about understanding that we have a responsibility to each other, but also the capacity to do more together. And if Europe did that, I believe it could improve its capabilities within the budgets it's already got, as well as increasing them to recognise the ongoing threat. But the challenge, I think, with the relationship transatlantically divides in two ways. One is militarily and in security and defence systems and structures and behaviours. And the worry, I think, that although I think the underlying relationship is strong, the concern of whether the president who does change his mind about things, I mean, people always do, but the worry that maybe this is not going to be a consistent approach, and that really matters. And that's something that I think leaders like my own Prime Minister are really getting to grips with, is developing the strength of a relationship, Prime Minister to President, that enables them to have these kind of conversations about where are we going, what's the plan, how do we do things, that I think are so important. But I think the other side of it is a bit more to do with the kind of approach that we take to the world. And the European Union is many things, but it is founded on values and ideals and human rights and a view of the world that is about enhancing democracy. I'm not suggesting America is not trying to do that, but it feels a bit different. And I think one of the challenges now is going to be over these next years to work out how we go forward together in lockstep on areas that, well, some would argue there are shifting sands a little bit in terms of the view of the world and how things might change. I always question and say to people, beware the rhetoric rather than the policy, because politicians the world over say many things, but it's what they do that makes a real difference.
Thanks. David, how do we deal with these inconsistencies? I mean, it's not only that there's a sort of nervousness that President Trump might change his mind, but we've had this administration's officials make statements like Secretary of Defense, now War, Pete Hegseth at Shangri-La Dialogue, announcing that Indo-Pacific is the priority theater and that U.S. will need to shift some resources to Indo-Pacific, and only weeks later, basically having to shift some resources from the Indo-Pacific to Middle East when President Trump decided to join the military strikes on Iran. So there's been a lot of cacophony coming out of the administration. Europeans have kind of struggled to not just interpret where US is, but also to anticipate the next steps. So, you know, using either your NATO or your French hat, whichever you choose, could you tell us, what do you think, how do we need to position ourselves in terms of policy and capabilities?
Yeah, I think this confusion, it adds another element of fear for us Europeans, adding to the fear from Russia, which has gone very vivid since 2022, to the lingering fear also about China. And so I think in such a state of fear and confusion, it's good to have a plan. And it's good to have institutions that help us carry out those plans. So we have the EU and NATO. And France is actually very invested in both at the moment. I'll speak more about the NATO part, although I would just point out that on the EU, I think there is a fairly clear diagnosis of what needs to be done. The Draghi report, Letta reports, and the issue is to master the political will to do it. And I think actually the fear has helped us break taboos in the past few years, and I think the coming additional crisis that we will have, no doubt, hopefully will help us accelerate these necessary reforms. When it comes to NATO, unlike maybe most members of this great alliance, in France we make a distinction between NATO and the alliance. The alliance is the political and legal commitment enshrined in the Washington Treaty, and we've always stood by that. No questions. NATO, we've had mixed feelings about, a mixed history about NATO as an organization, because we felt that for some time it actually undermined the alliance by allowing the Europeans to be free riders. In this sense, we agree with some of the American criticism. I would say at this point when we are talking, coming back to your initial question, I would say NATO is very much strengthening and not undermining the alliance. First, I don't know exactly in which situation we would be if this alliance rested only on the Washington Treaty and was not backed up by a strong organization with Americans embedded, in particular in the military structure. If it was just a paper, important paper, I don't know where we would be exactly. So it brings some degree of stability. But even more importantly, it is now forcing the Europeans to step up. It's true that the criticism goes back from the US to Eisenhower in terms of the Europeans not doing enough. But it's actually true that it's back at the Hague summit that we took this commitment to go to 5%, including 3.5% of, strictly speaking, defense spending. And I think that's a very good news. We do it because of the Trump administration, we do it because of Russia, we do it because inside our own countries, we realize that that's what needs to be done. Frankly, we didn't, if you ask French experts on defense and security and you say, what is the ballpark figure of where our defense budget should be, they will say 3.5. So it's actually good that through NATO we are forced to do this increased spending, but now we have to transform this into capabilities. I would argue in large part into European capabilities. And we have to have the political willingness to use these capabilities in the right way. And on this, there is still a lot of work to be done, and particularly at NATO.
And I'll just follow up on that very briefly. Do you see sort of opportunities in that regard linked to the current administration? Because I was just looking at the figures. By 2023, Europe accounted for 35% of total US arm export value. We know that restrainers in this administration actually insist that Europeans develop their own industrial military base. France has always been at the forefront of the argument that we need to sort of invest more in producing in Europe. So, you know, what are the signals coming from Washington these days in this regard?
Conflicting. So depending on who you talk to, there are some people who completely get that if you want Europeans to step up and to be strong allies long term, it requires to develop their own capabilities. Some people completely get that, and others are very insistent that they should that basically we should buy American, and the nice way to put it is to talk about the transatlantic industrial base. So I would say it's conflicting, but in my view it's already an improvement, because before it was not conflicting, it was only skepticism towards development of a specific European industrial base. And you remember there was this 3D policy that we should not duplicate and we should not discriminate and so on. So I interpret this confusion as actually a sign that maybe on the US side as well there is a debate, and maybe there is the realization that to have stronger Europeans able to do things by themselves with their own capabilities in the end is good news for America.
Georgette, can I ask you on that, while we're still on that topic? In our conversations with basically defense strategists who are close to people that are now in Pentagon in sort of middle-ranking positions, we often hear that repetition of the message that we heard from Vice President Vance in 2024 already while he was senator, that America's stocks are depleted and that Europeans need to step up and ratchet up their own military production. When we talk to the restrainers who have, close links to Pentagon, they tell us if you order Patriots today, you will get them in 2035. We don't have enough. And now we hear, sort of following the UN General Assembly meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky, that the US is considering delivering Tomahawks. How do you see this? I mean, do you actually think that the US can continue in delivering at the speed that is needed? And, what do you expect from this rumor that it might provide Tomahawks to Ukraine?
If I might first comment on, you keep saying you are hearing. I don't know where you're hearing from, but we know there's a lot of disinformation and out there, as well as the fact that the United States, we're used to being the whipping boy. And I can get defensive at times. In fact, you said something earlier about how we shifted resources from the Indo-Pacific to the Middle East. Well, I might suggest to you, wherever you heard that from, that when you have the greatest military in the world, you tend to be asked to solve a lot of problems that aren't even directly yours. And so if we're shifting, it's because the world has put the burden on us to solve these problems, and that takes resources. And while we've built this military, we can't be every place all the time. And to the other panelists, the fact is, that's why we want to see a strong, resilient Europe, because we know we can't do this alone. And that's the point we're trying to say here. We need Europe to build a military-industrial base, because otherwise, do we have enough Tomahawk missiles? Was that the question? I don't know the answer to that. I suspect that, look, I don't know that any of us anticipated Russia going into Ukraine, although all of us watched for 1 year. Putin put 100,000 troops on the border of Ukraine, and we did nothing, even though he told us what he was going to do. So did we ramp up producing Tomahawk missiles? No, we didn't. And so here we are. If this is the space that we're working in now with Ukraine, where will it be next? This is a very complicated, challenging world we live in. There are threats all around us. And that's why, no, to answer your question, we probably don't have enough to be able to meet all of these challenges. And that's why it is so important that we work together to build this resilience and build this capability. And this was the wake-up call.
Thank you. So that kind of brings us to the next topic, John, which I wanted you to talk about, China and Trump's China security strategy. Where do you see it going? You know, if I was to bet before January 2025, and also once we've seen who are the people going into Pentagon, someone like Undersecretary for Strategy, Bridge Colby, who was one of the most vocal China hawks and advocates of shifting resources to Indo-Pacific, I would have thought that this is going to be a priority in the national defense strategy. We will see, but what seems to be the case is that Western Hemisphere is prioritized. We haven't heard much about China. Could you talk a little bit about Trump's China strategy?
Sure, with the caveat that I guess sort of to Ambassador Mosbacher's point, I'm not even going to purport to hear. I'm just going to purport to observe from afar because they're not exactly consulting me on this. But maybe just picking up where I left off in my last answer about the globalized nature of alliances going to a stay-in-your-lane approach. What is the downside of that? Because I think maybe it's important to say why I think that's problematic. One downside of that is that we collectively, the countries that are aligned with Ukraine, have made Russia pay a global cost for its war. We've made them pay an enormous cost on the battlefield. We've also made them pay a cost in diplomatic relations, in their economy, that has been borne not just by this region, but beyond. That, I think, is quite an important demonstration effect, potentially, for other potential aggressors in the world, or other actual aggressors in the world, including China. We wanted China to believe that were it to take similarly aggressive actions in the Indo-Pacific, it would also pay a global cost, which is why we wanted our allies here invested in that relationship. The other reason, by the way, why that's important is that Russia and China obviously are linking these theaters. China is making massive inputs into Russia's industrial base, as is North Korea, by the way, another Indo-Pacific country. And Russia, I am quite confident, is taking steps that benefit China as well. You know, we read reports about Russian training of Chinese air assault forces, of Russian help with technology for quieting submarines, which, you know, could narrow the gap in what is a major strategic advantage for the United States in the Indo-Pacific. So the other side is doing this, and again, I think leaving that capability and that globalized effect on the sidelines, not helpful. Where is this going? I mean, by all observations, at least, it looks like this is headed towards some kind of a deal. And I don't think, by the way, inherently a deal between the United States and China is a bad thing. I think there will be a big sigh of relief among many global economic actors if that is actually what happens. But what that deal looks like really does matter. And I am not sure that this administration is prioritizing the things, at least I would prioritize, and I think other countries in the world would prioritize in terms of what we should extract from China in a deal. Yes, it's a good thing if the TikTok asset in the United States is divested by China, and that algorithm is under control of Americans. Would I put that at the very top of the list of structural issues in the U.S.-China relationship? I wouldn't. It does seem like that has been a priority. And I worry that there are a number of other steps like that that could generate very positive headlines. Buying a bunch of Boeing aircraft, buying a bunch of agricultural products, allowing the deal that's been in place for some time but was paused for an American financial firm to buy the Hutchison port assets in Panama, that I think the United States would find very appealing, but that would not go to addressing the underlying issues. And if China, in return for steps like that, extracts security concessions from the United States, on Taiwan, extracts concessions on export controls, on sensitive technologies, I worry there will be a real strategic imbalance in this deal. So I'm not against a deal. I do think that's where things are headed, but we should watch the terms very carefully.
There was an article in Wall Street Journal yesterday, which I didn't read because it was behind the paywall and I couldn't access it from here, but the title was that Xi Jinping is trying to extract concessions from Trump exactly on Taiwan. And so, you know, say just hypothetically, I mean, it's, you know, there's different takes, but if the Western Hemisphere is prioritized, again, Georgette, to your question, our work has really been very intensely for 3 years with sort of defense strategists and staffers, etc., who ended up in the administration. In Pentagon, in Vice President's office, in Director of National Intelligence, State Department. So most of our, if you want, workshop participants for 2 years, and the things that we've been discussing are now occupying relatively high-level positions, but of course they need to adjust to what President Trump decides, and as we've seen, no one really sort of defines policy until he says what he wants.
It's the President of the United States prerogative.
But, you know, you'd sort of think this administration is ideologically more cohesive on sort of the need for restraint, the need to sort of not be the policeman of the world, and that was President Trump's electoral message as well, than was his first-term administration. I mean, he's left many, you know, Mike Pompeo didn't make it back, and...
I'm not quite sure I'm following your point.
So my point is that the foreign policy sort of camps in Trump's cabinet that are sort of in Pentagon and around Vice President and so on would like to see greater focus on either Indo-Pacific or Homeland Security, having Europeans carry the burden. And, you know, if it was up to them, probably would have implemented a bit more radical measures than we are seeing right now from the European perspective. And I guess my question was, in fact, going to David and Catherine, if we assume that not even sort of shift to Indo-Pacific and deterring China in Taiwan is the sort of key strategic objective of Trump administration, or that there's certain concessions being made on strategic industrial policy, European policy has for a long time been sort of a function of what US did, right? And we were always sort of trying to align and close the gap. What should European strategy on China look like, specifically also regarding this China-Russia connection on Ukraine and dual-use technology? David, do you want to start? And then we can go to Catherine. Thanks.
Yeah, we Europeans, we shouldn't need the US to realize we have a challenge with China. I mean, if the US wasn't there, we'd still have a challenge with China. And then it's up to us to define how we manage this challenge. I think for all the rhetoric, which is sometimes heated these days when it comes to China, we are still pretty much on this partner, confront, rival, you know, triptych that we have, that the US had. You don't deal with a challenge like China the way we dealt collectively with the challenge from the Soviet Union. Soviet Union, I think the trade between the US and the Soviet Union was $1 billion a year. China is 600 or so, and even more for EU. So it's, what makes it a challenge is that it ranges across a very, very wide spectrum from military, an area in which I don't think Europeans have a lot to bring to the table, if I'm honest. Maybe my country has a little bit to bring with a few others, but collectively we don't have a lot to bring, which is why I get the point that NATO doesn't have that much to do, at least when it comes to a military discussion about the Indo-Pacific, in our view. But it's much more than that. It's a scientific challenge, it's an economic trade challenge, intelligence, and so on. And so for us, I think most of the tools that we need to develop collectively to address this challenge as Europeans, they're actually in the European Union. And if we are to have a serious transatlantic discussion about how to address together the China threat, I think that takes us more to another part of town in Brussels than the one I'm sitting in. There is some interesting work to be done at NATO when it comes to China's support to Russia or China's direct actions towards our part of the world. But I think if we're looking for European leverage, that needs to be a discussion between the US and the EU. But for the Europeans, it means that they need to define very clearly their own interests when it comes to China. And we've been pushing this agenda quite strongly within the EU.
Catherine, last one to you, and then we'll open up for Q&A. What are our interests, and what is that leverage that we can use?
So when I think about the relationship with China, two thoughts come into my mind. The first is, when I was High Representative, I would often put China on the agenda for our long days of debate. And almost invariably, one or two member states would say, no, let's not do that. And the reason was a combination of people finding it challenging to work out what a common approach to China would be across a continent, especially against a backdrop where individual nations were trying to develop their own economic links with China during particularly the financial crisis of 2008 and the aftermath. So it was a very difficult thing to do, and I would argue probably remains the case. For China, what they see is the impossibility of understanding what this European approach is when they find individual countries change their mind or give a different take on what that might look like. And I take my own country as a European country, the UK, where I say quite often that we went from golden age to ice age with China in about 10 years. And so it's not surprising, A, that China has not got a common approach to Europe, but also that Europe hasn't got a common approach to China. And so I would argue that one of the things that needs to happen is getting that common approach, because without it, there is no leverage, really. And it's also about meeting of minds between Europe and the United States, not just simply following the United States. Geographically, politically, strategically, our relationship with China is not quite the same. And therefore, if we're going to have serious conversations with the United States about how we collaborate, it should be from a position of knowing what our own positions really are. And that's, I think, lacking still. When it comes to, can I just finish on Russia? When it comes to the situation in Ukraine, I can only cite what I've said many times before, that when I was doing the Iran negotiations, I worked with the Chinese and the Russians, and Europeans and Americans, of course, in the context of the Iran negotiations for nearly 5 years, and spent huge amounts of time with everyone, some of it more enjoyable than others. But I learned one thing, which is that Russia and China were not the same, and they were not always on the same page, and the relationship is not joined together on everything. And so we need to kind of exploit that in the sense that we should be looking for difference, and we should be looking for where we can, in a sense, drive the wedge and move one away from the other, because I think that's going to be important for the future.
Thank you. So we'll open for questions because we have about 9 minutes left, and Catherine has to leave sharp to the airport. I see one hand there in the background, and the gentleman in the first row here. So let's take these two first.
Hello. Volodymyr Dubovik was at Odessa University, Ukraine, and also senior fellow at the CIPA, Center for European Policy Analysis. I have one question for John Feiner, one question for Georgette Mosbacher. John, for your question is, in retrospect, do you think that your administration that you worked for, the previous administration, Biden administration, has done a successful work in dealing with escalation fears on the part of Russia in the last 3.5 years? Because it might not come a big surprise to you that many Ukrainians have doubts about that, but what do you see when you're looking back at how you dealt with this escalation fears, on Russia's part? For Ambassador Mosbacher, as someone who has been an ambassador here and very committed to U.S.-Polish relations, do you feel that the U.S. should probably do something more today, more steps to alleviate security concerns and fears that Poland now has with regard to drones flying over, or maybe situation in the Baltic Sea, things like that? Do you think that U.S. should actually assist? It's one of the most loyal and committed allies in the region, Poland. Thank you.
Super. Let's start with that one, and then we'll go to John.
Okay. I think it was 2 or 3 days ago, there was an incursion, or you thought there was going to be an incursion, and you scrambled NATO's jets and Polish jets. I'm not sure you're aware that we had 6 refueling planes in the air over Poland that day. That could have, over 100 planes we could have quickly had it really been an attack. So if that isn't a testament to the fact that the U.S. is committed to Poland's security, I don't know a better example. That happened 3 days ago, I believe. So these are exercises that we are participating in that are important for the operability. And I would say that you will continue to see that and more of these kind of exercises of working together, the NATO allies, to strengthen that inoperability.
John.
First of all, thank you for the question. You'll not be surprised. It's not the first time I've been asked this. And I'll give you as candid an answer as I can. I'm not one of these people who leaves government and decides to spend the rest of my life talking about how perfect everything was when we were there. So you won't get that exact answer from me. And I am confident that this is going to be a subject that will be both studied and debated very intensively for a very long time. But I will say a few things. One is, if you had told me in early February of 2022 that sitting here today, late 2025, the war would still be going on in Ukraine, that Russia would have suffered more than 1 million casualties, that the war would almost entirely still be fought in the eastern, call it 20%, at least on the ground, of the territory of Ukraine, that Russia would not have used weapons of mass destruction, and that Russia would not have attacked NATO and drawn NATO into a direct conflict. Given the assessments that we were getting at that early stage, I would have taken that deal. And I think most people who are analyzing the situation dispassionately would take that deal. That does not mean we did everything perfect. But I'll say a couple of other things just because you asked. Most of what we were asked to do, provide F-16s sooner, provide tanks sooner, provide ATACMS sooner, involved getting Ukraine different weapon systems at an earlier date. I think those were all reasonable and legitimate requests. And by the way, we granted every single one of those requests, maybe not in the first moment that it was made, but eventually. But the reality is, at least as I assess it, the things that we did that were more significant than any of those things that were being demanded from the outside, massive surge of artillery into Ukraine, where we literally bought up every artillery shell that existed everywhere in the world, including our own stocks, and then looked for ways to shift Ukraine from 152 to 155 and ramp up production. That kept Ukraine in the war. Air defense. Where at nobody's request, we just decided to tell the rest of the world, all other purchasers of U.S. air defense equipment, that you were moving to the back of the line and Ukraine was moving to the front because their need was severe. And by the way, if you were ever in a situation like they were in, we would do the same thing for you. Seeding Ukraine's industrial base so that, and by the way, we did not envision this, but so that they would be able to develop a capability in unmanned systems that is basically now replacing artillery and replacing long-range strike on the battlefield through the sheer force of their innovation out of necessity and creativity. By the way, Ukraine gets all the credit for the outcomes I described and for being able to take advantage of these things. But these were things our administration decided to do, not because people on panels like this were telling us that's what we had to do. We did a lot of those things. I think the things that we chose to do ultimately were more consequential, but others will decide. As I said, this is going to get studied for a long time.
We have 3 minutes left. The gentleman in the front had one question. Please keep it to 20 seconds if possible, if you want to get an answer.
Sure, thank you very much. I'm from New England and we talk fast, so that should not be a problem. Trevelyan Wing from Cambridge University, where I'm a fellow. I have a quick question. I guess here the pivot to Asia, the Asia-Pacific region, of course, predates Trump. The concerns about European countries not paying enough for their defense predates Trump, as both ambassadors indeed quite rightly pointed out. And as an American, I'm very aware of sentiments back home on this front too. To what extent then, when it comes to security and defense policy, strictly speaking, is a perceived crisis of the transatlantic relationship, when it comes to confidence on this side of the pond, one of tonality and linguistics? Thank you.
Would you like anyone in particular to answer a question? I actually don't.
Okay, thank you. It's a good question. and I understand optics, and we deal with misinformation and disinformation that the Russians do much better than we do, I might add. But I do think that it may have been blown out of proportion. You make the point that President Trump's style is a very confrontational style. That's how he sees provoking to get something done. I know from my own style is to be direct and frank, and some people in this room had to deal with that and put up with that when I was here. But that was my style, to get results. And so I do think there is, some of this is about the perception and about how I think I said earlier, putting a mirror up to yourself and saying, having someone else put the mirror up to yourself. And that's uncomfortable. But while I have the mic for one more second, I'd like to make a point about the previous administration. I personally believe that the mistake was made that it was an incremental war. I think you did a good job in it being incremental. But I don't think that's the way you win a war. I think it's how a war goes on and on. If we'd given them everything they needed in the beginning, but you doled it out little by little, and I'm not saying we're doing a better job. It's not what I'm saying at all right? But I do think that something we could have learned, we all should learn from this, is that you have to go in to win. And you have to say, we've lost that. Saying, you know, I'm going to win. I'm going into this fight to win it. And I will do everything I have to do to win it. And I think that that's the mistake that was made here. And now we're almost 4 years into this, that making an incremental war is a war that continues to go on. And I'm not saying we're not doing the same thing. That's not what I'm saying.
That's a perfect way to end this, and we're over the time. Please join me in thanking the panelists. And many thanks to the organizers.